Welcome to LitMovements, a series of podcasts about American realism, modernism, and postmodernism. This three-part series was created by Dr. Kristen Jacobson at Stockton College. The Office of the Provost, through the Summer Technology Academy, provided the training and funding for this project. Episode 3, Postmodernism. So what is postmodernism? It's a movement that roughly begins after World War II. It's a post-1945 movement. Some would say it really doesn't begin in any real way until circa 1960 and continues to the present. And that is a result in part of the fall of the industrial age, that is, with the change in our economic condition that changes our literature and our aesthetics as well, so that a post-industrial society and the rise of a global economy produce a distinctive era and produce a distinctive aesthetics. The stories of postmodernism have been defined in a variety of different ways, and while folks may disagree about the relative difference between modernism and postmodernism, I'm going to move from the assumption that postmodernism is marking out a distinctive aesthetics. That is, it's more than just modernism on steroids, that it's more than just a sort of continued variety of the ways in which modernism tried to make it new, but that economic condition combined with other social conditions and the rise of technology in our lives has really created and crafted a distinct aesthetics. One helpful way to think about postmodernism is to think about key landmarks. And these landmarks that I have listed for you here are coming from the Norton Anthology of Postmodern American Fiction. And the way in which this anthology is organized, it's grouped into different categories, although several of the authors blur the boundaries between, in very much postmodern fashion, blur the boundaries between these different categories or landmarks of postmodernism. So breaking the frame, much like modernism, there's the formal innovation, the blurring of the lines between fact and fiction, the ways in which popular culture and high culture collide, the merging again of genres, revising history and genre, the questioning of meta-narratives like an overarching history, and then the use and effects of technology and the concern with technoculture in terms of the content of the literature as well. And so often too you'll see science fiction writing being taken very seriously in postmodern and really recognized as not a sort of subordinate or lower popular kind of genre, but seen as literature in its own right. And a part of that, I think, is an effect of the revising of our understanding of the boundary between high culture and popular culture. You also have some really fascinating writers, Samuel Delany, for example, who's writing in the genre of science fiction and showing how this popular genre can have very serious elements. There are several texts that deal with the collapse of hierarchies, especially the hierarchy between popular culture and high culture. Many of them use popular forms, such as comic form, and combine that with very serious literary subjects and ask us the question in terms of our aesthetics. Why is the comic form just necessarily a popular form? Is it the subject matter that's light? And what if the subject matter isn't light? Does that mean that it's a part of high culture? Is it our understanding that the aesthetics of writing a comic takes less talent, less artistic talent? But what if those drawings are really very carefully rendered? And so texts where popular culture and high culture collide might include Crazy Cat by Jake Cantor, Linda Berry's Come Over, Ray Anderson's Stories from the Nerve Bible, Robert Coover, A Night at the Movies, Mark Lerner, Tooth Imprints on a Corn Dog, Curtis White, Memories of My Father, Watching TV, Ricardo Cortez Cruz, Premature Autopsies, authors like Bobby Ann Mason, Barry Guilford, and I think somebody like Art Spiegelman is someone who does that all also under the rubric of revising history and asking us to rethink history. Postmodernism is really engaged with questioning notions of historical progress. And I think as soon as you start questioning notions of historical progress, something that arguably Toni Morrison's novel Beloved does, as well as Art Spiegelman's Maus, then you're also often looking too at a collapse of time and space, which is not necessarily brought about through technology, but it also may show the ways in which history is layered into the realities of the present, that it's more of a palimpsest, that it's the events of history are as real or as present in the present moment as they are a part of the past, and certainly something where the ghost in Beloved comes a part of the characters' lives. Leslie Marmon Silko's Ceremony might also be seen as a text that is about not only revising history, asking us to listen to a voice that is telling a story from another's perspective, but also it asks us to question the notion of historical progress. If we were to continue along the musical theme, we might say that the quintessential music of postmodernism is rap music, and that's because of the ways in which it employs intertextuality and pastiche, like much of the postmodern literature. That is, it'll take a text that already exists and play with it by inserting it into another context and another text. And that's a way of understanding how postmodernism is distinct from modernism. In doing this, that is, in placing texts intertextually or using pastiche, we can also see that there's a kind of critique of authorship or an ultimate authority. Some of this too is also coming through in the rejections of notions of historical progress, of the collapse of hierarchies between popular culture and high culture, and this is reflected in literature that experiments with genres, that it'll use a comic book form of a genre, something like Art Spiegelman's Maus, to discuss the Holocaust and the history of the Holocaust. It's also about revising history at the same time.
Before looking at these themes in more detail, let's look at the Bedford Glossary's definition of postmodernism.
The Bedford Glossary defines postmodernism as a term referring to certain radically experimental works of literature and art produced after World War II. Postmodernism is distinguished from modernism, which generally refers to the revolution in art and literature that occurred during the period 1910 through 1930, particularly following the disillusioning experience of World War I. The postmodern era, with its potential for mass destruction and its shocking history of genocide, has evoked a continuing disillusionment similar to that widely experienced during the modern period. Much of postmodernist writing reveals and highlights the alienation of individuals and the meaninglessness of human existence. Postmodernists frequently stress that humans desperately and ultimately unsuccessfully cling to illusions of security to conceal and forget the void over which their lives are perched.
End quote. While the Bedford definition is helpful, we haven't fully fleshed out the difference between postmodernism and modernism.
Perhaps one of the most cited ways of trying to understand the difference between modernism and postmodernism is from an essay by Hassan called Toward a Concept of Postmodernism, which is in a book, The Postmodern Turn, which was published in 1987. And in this essay, Hassan has a column of characteristics and elements that he labels modern, and on the other side he has a list of elements that he labels postmodern. So, for example, modernism is really seen more as a closed form with depth. That also has a sort of distance to it. Postmodernism is seen more open, more associated with play, with deconstruction, and with surface, as opposed to depth. And as opposed to hierarchy, it's more anarchy. So in the story of Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall, if the modernists were very anxious over Humpty Dumpty's condition, were trying to put those fragments back together again, the postmoderns really weren't that anxious about it. They would say, oh great, let's make scrambled eggs, or Humpty Dumpty is just as fun, just as cool, scattered into fragments out of these orders. His more fluid identity, I guess in this case both as a literally he's more fluid, and also as a sort of more metaphor for how identity is seen in often in postmodern texts, that notion of fluidity is what's emphasized as opposed to more rigid boundaries. Another theme in postmodern literature that you often see is the rejection of essentialist notions of identity. That is, that our identity is biologically constructed and not culturally constructed. The postmodern critique of essentialism, though, is not without its critique, or not without at least a cautionary tale. And I think that Bell Hook's Postmodern Blackness does a good job of looking at the ways in which the postmodern critique of essentialism as it pertains to the construction of identity should be taken with a grain of salt. Bell Hooks in Postmodern Blackness provides a cautionary example. She asks us to really consider the postmodern critique of essentialism when she writes the following, quote, "It never surprises me when black folks respond to the critique of essentialism, especially when it denies the validity of identity politics by saying, yeah, it's easy to give up identity when you've got one," end quote. Actually, she goes on to say in that same passage, quote, "Should we not be suspicious of postmodern critiques of the subject when they surface at a historical moment when many subjugated people feel themselves coming to voice for the first time?" End quote. And so I think what she's asking us here is to consider, well, if we're critiquing identity and calling for or pointing out the fluidity of identity categories, whether they're race, class, gender, sexuality, that has a liberatory function, but it also seems to deny the realities of many, and what she's focusing on in her essay, Postmodern Blackness, is really black folks. So the thing to keep in mind there is that with the rejection of essentialist notions of identity also comes with it some political consequences. And what's interesting to look at are the ways in which both African American writers, Asian American writers, Native American writers, white writers explore the idea of a fluid identity in postmodern culture. Sometimes when students start reading postmodern fiction, especially, they ask, when are we going to get to the plot? Because the plot is not always laid out in a linear fashion. And in fact, you may have visual elements in the text. You might have fragments. You might have elements in a different language mixed in with fiction and nonfiction, poetry. And so the construction of a plot is sometimes difficult in the fiction or in a variety of the genres that you might read under the rubric of postmodernism. And so a couple strategies for reading postmodern fiction are instead of maybe necessarily reading in the same way that you're traditionally trained. Let's put these plot points together and look for how is the action building towards a climax, and then then to the short conclusion. That it's really more about process than the product of the conclusion so much. So it's really to be open to the journey. Where are these different fragments? Where are these different chapters or snippets taking you to? Look for possible destinations, and destinations as a plural as opposed to one conclusion might be especially key here. So if we think about this visually, realism was to photography, as modernism is to collage and jazz, where postmodernism is to pastiche and hip-hop. And I think visually there are a couple of different ways in which to see postmodern art. Realism doesn't disappear with the advent of postmodernism. And in fact, some folks think that realism undergoes some changes, and so that they would call it something like neo-realism or maybe even dirty realism. And I think that the picture, in terms of a visual representation, or the painting by Jesse Trevino, emphasizes this element of a neo or dirty realism. The picture is very realist in its presentation, yet its hyper-reality calls attention to itself as a construct. There are elements there of the fantastical in its presentation of the subject in the very hyper clean lines that we know we're not looking at a photograph, we know we're not looking at a realist painting because it's so bright, it's so clear and crisp. On the other hand, something like How Molly Lost Her Accent emphasizes maybe some of those qualities we were talking about in terms of pastiche with a kind of more collage, or we can see how the construction of her identity is put together with all these different pieces that are surrounding her. At the same time, her identity is sort of fluid in the sense that we see her centered, but then the rest of her body is more diffuse in the ways in which all those different elements, like Yale, we see the banner Yale there in the right-hand corner, are the elements, the culture that is constructing her identity.
So we've returned to the issue of essentialism, or the postmodern critique of essentialism, which in turn brings us back to the issue of rethinking even what that critique means. This theory that deconstructs itself gives rise to more than one sense of postmodernism. In other words, one of the things that should be becoming more and more apparent are the ways in which postmodernism is really about postmodernisms. So where do we go from here?
Postmodern works tend to question or cast suspicion concerning neat or easy conclusion. The recent film No Country for Old Men, based on the novel by Cormac McCarthy, epitomizes this. The ending to The Crying of Lot 49 by Thomas Pynchon also exhibits this. It ends just when you were hoping to get all of the answers.